Chapter 16. "It sure is creepy in here, Black Jack," Matt whispered as he and the old mule made their way further along the trail. The strange noises that they had been hearing were now followed by the rustling of leaves. He turned around slowly and was looking behind him when the mule suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Matt quickly turned in his seat to find two Indians standing on the trail before him. They were dressed in deerskin shirts and pants. Their long black hair fell down to their shoulders. One raised a tomahawk, while the other held a bow with a long arrow pointed directly at Matt's heart. They didn't appear to be much older than Matt, but this didn't lessen his terror, for though they were just children, these Indian boys displayed a fierceness and a courage that Matt had never seen in boys before. Looking into their unblinking dark eyes, he felt the commanding presence of their strength. It left him feeling weak and soft and frightened. Matt found himself doing what he always did when he was truly terrified. He closed his eyes. He had never been able to watch a horror movie on TV all the way through without closing his eyes and asking Katie to tell him what was happening. There was no one to tell him what was happening now, so he just sat with his eyes shut tight, listening and waiting. Suddenly, he heard some leaves rustling and more footsteps. Matt tried to squeeze his eyes shut tighter. "There's more of them," he thought frantically. "Probably a whole tribe. I'll never live to—" Before he could finish his thought, he heard someone speak. "Oh my gosh, doesn't that look like the chief?" came a voice from the bushes. Matt cracked one eye open to see the two Indians still standing before him. Then he opened the other eye to see Hooter, looking out from behind the bushes. "Hoot!" Matt cried out loud. But on hearing this, the Indians thought he was giving some kind of war cry, and they rushed the mule and pulled Matt off. "No!" Hooter yelled, jumping out of the bushes and coming to Matt's aid. "Friend! He's friend," Hooter tried to explain. "Hooter, I don't think I've ever been so glad to see anybody in my whole life," Matt exclaimed as the two boys embraced. "You look awfully good to us, too," came another familiar voice from the bushes. Matt looked over to see Tony coming into the clearing. "Tony!" Matt shouted as Tony joined their embrace, and the three boys jumped up and down for joy, all trying to talk at once. "Where are Katie and Q?" Matt asked, looking back to the bushes. "We've got some bad news, Matt," Tony began. Matt looked over to the two Indians. They had relaxed on seeing that Matt meant no harm. While they waited for the boys to talk, they were busy picking berries from a bush along the trail. Matt turned back to Tony. "Katie, is she hurt?" he cried. "No, she's okay," Tony told him. "Well, kind of okay," Hooter added. "What do you mean, kind of okay?" Matt asked anxiously. "Why aren't you with her across the river?" "She's not hurt, Matt, believe me. This is what happened." Tony tried to sound calm. "We never made it across the river last night. First, Adam Hibbs fell on his gun. The bayonet stuck him right in the stomach. They said he had never had a bayonet on his musket before. I guess most of the men haven't, and they weren't used to using them. Anyway, it was pretty bad. They don't have telephones to dial 911 or rescue squad to take you to the hospital when you get hurt," Hooter interrupted. "So what happened next?" Matt asked impatiently. Tony squirmed and continued in a whisper. "Then our boat hit this chunk of ice and started to go under," he said softly. "Oh no!" Matt gasped. "It's okay, Matt, really," Hooter assured him. "We were rescued by a flat boat that was crossing with some horses. They had to let the horses off so we could all fit on, though. That was horrible, to watch the horses trying to swim. And then Adam Hibbs, well, he was bleeding so much." Hooter's voice trailed off and Tony continued. "Anyway, we came back to the shore with Adam Hibbs. They laid him next to a fire and told us to wait with him until they could get another boat to cross with." Hooter's eyes suddenly filled with tears. He was in a lot of pain, and they all thought he was hallucinating or something because he kept saying that he knew we were from another time. "It was the same Adam Hibbs that was lost on the lake then?" Matt asked. "No," Hooter said. "It was his grandson. Adam explained to us that his grandfather had told him this fantastic story all about traveling through time in a rowboat. His grandfather told him to look out for the old rowboat, and if there was anyone in it, not to be surprised if they were dressed in strange-looking clothes. I think he was really glad to see us and know that his grandfather was telling the truth. He was in such pain, though, that it was hard for him to talk," Tony added. "It got so that he could only whisper, and so Q had to bend down to hear him. Most of the stuff about his grandfather he whispered to Q." "But where is Q? And where is Katie?" Matt asked anxiously. "I'm getting to that," Tony winced. "This officer told us to stay with Adam Hibbs until he came back for us. He went off looking for a boat, and then Adam, Well, Adam closed his eyes and he never opened them again. We just sort of sat there waiting by ourselves. Then Katie saw it, Hooter interrupted. Katie saw what? Matt asked. The old rowboat, the one we came in, Tony explained. It was tied to a boat that had just come over from the other side of the river. The soldiers must have found it in an ice jam on their way across. We heard some officers talking about it, Hooter told him. They said the rowboat was too small to carry many men across, but that it should be saved in case they needed it later. They told 2 soldiers to drag the boat into some bushes to hide it. Remember how you said Q was to be our brain? Tony interrupted. Well, he had this idea that we should find you and then all get back in the rowboat. He was sure from what Adam Hibbs told him that it could get us back home. So it sounded like a good plan, didn't it? He waited for Matt to agree. I don't know, I guess so, Matt said impatiently. Go on, what happened next? Well, I guess it wasn't such a good plan after all, because things didn't work out the way we wanted. Tony hesitated. Will you just spit it out, Tony? Matt pleaded. Okay, Tony continued. Since no one was really watching us, it was easy to slip away from the shore. The soldiers were all so busy unloading the boats and forming into regiments, no one even missed us. We made our way into the woods, just above the river. I scouted ahead of everyone. Yeah, about 3 inches ahead, Hooter smirked. Well, ahead anyway, Tony shot Hooter a smirk back. I didn't think we should go too far into the woods and lose sight of the soldiers, he explained to Matt. Q's plan was to follow the soldiers from the woods and then catch up with you. But because of the storm, it was too hard to see where we were going, and before too long we were lost. It was a nightmare, Matt, really, Hooter added. We were all so wet and cold and there was nothing around for as far as we could see but snow and trees. We were desperate to find some shelter. Matt knew from his own experience just how desperate they must have felt. Katie was beginning to cry, Tony continued. She wouldn't walk any further, so we found this big old hollow tree and put her in that. Q stayed with her while Hooter and I scouted around for some dry wood we could use to make a fire. We hadn't gone too far when we heard them. He stopped and looked over at Hooter. Who? Matt cried. Heard who? The enemy, Tony told him. I guess it was the British, but they weren't speaking English. At least, it didn't sound like English. They had these fancy blue and white uniforms on, and big black hats that stuck way up on their heads. It almost sounded like they were talking in German. Oh my gosh, Matt mumbled. The Hessians. See, Tony, I told you they weren't English, Hooter said. So what happened then? Matt wanted to know. Hooter and Tony looked down at the ground, too embarrassed to meet Matt's eyes. They carried Katie and Q off on their soldiers, Tony told him in a whisper. And you didn't try to stop them? Matt cried. Matt, they were huge, and they had these swords, Tony tried to explain. We started to follow them, but it was so dark and we were so tired. We stopped to rest, and I guess we were falling asleep when we were woken up by our friends over here, he said, pointing to the Indians. They saved our lives, Hooter added. They really know how to live in the woods. They made a fire and gave us something to eat. Hooter's voice had suddenly lowered. What? What is it? Matt looked from Hooter to Tony. Rabbit, Tony smiled. The Indians caught this little rabbit and roasted it over the fire. You know how Hoot gets about little animals. I kept telling him that his Big Mac was once a little calf. Tony smiled again. But Matt wasn't smiling. Did the Indians see the Hessians? He asked. I don't know. They don't speak much English, Tony told him. But the Hessians were on foot, right? Matt asked. They were pretty far into the woods to be able to travel on horses, Hooter said, and there weren't any around that we could see. Okay, then we know what we have to do, Matt said authoritatively. We do? Hooter and Tony replied. We have to find the Hessians and rescue Katie and Q, Matt told them. That's great, Matt. But just how are we supposed to do that? Tony asked. That's a good question, Tony. Now, if we only had Q here to give us a good answer, Hooter said, walking toward the Indians, who were crouched by a bush. We can figure this out without Q, Matt told them. I'm the president of the club, and I'll think of something. Don't worry. He turned to Blackjack, who had patiently waited on the trail for him. Coming up beside the mule, Matt whispered in his ear, You wouldn't have any ideas, would you, Blackjack? But Blackjack just blinked his eyes and yawned. No, I didn't think so, Matt mumbled. Chapter 17. If Katie was in the clutches of those bloodthirsty Hessians, Matt knew that he had to do everything in his power to rescue her. When Henry and Israel had first told him of the mercenaries, Matt had been terrified at the thought of having to face the giants. Now he was so worried about Katie that he was afraid he wouldn't be able to find them. Matt walked over to Hooter and Tony, who had joined the Indian boys. They were filling a leather bag with some bright red berries they'd picked off a bush. Hooter was about to put some in his mouth when one of the Indians grabbed his hand and knocked the berries out of it. Whoa, Hooter called out. What's the matter? They must not be safe for eating, Hoot. Look, Matt said, pointing to the shorter Indian, who was holding his stomach and making a face. He's trying to show you that the berries are poison. So if they don't eat them, what do they do with them? Hooter wondered aloud. I don't know what they do with them, Tony said as he watched the Indians continue to fill the bag. But I bet they could tell you where all the berries are in this woods, and which ones are poisonous and which are not. I'd give anything to know the kind of stuff they know. You're right, Tony, you're right, Matt mumbled. They probably do know a lot of things about these woods, and if anyone could tell us where the Hessians and Katie and Q are, I bet they could. Well, it's too bad you can't ask them, Tony sighed. Who says I can't? Matt replied, walking up to the taller Indian boy. We need to find the soldiers, Matt began. Big, tall men, he said, putting his hands over his head. Then he motioned to his clothes. They have fancy uniforms and guns. Matt picked up a stick and aimed it like a gun. And they have my little sister, he tried to tell them, getting down on his knees and walking around with his thumb in his mouth. The Indians stood watching him in silence, and then they looked at each other and began to laugh. Hooter and Tony laughed too, for Matt did look pretty funny. Cut it out, guys, Matt ordered, taking his thumb out of his mouth. Suddenly he had an idea. Everyone watched as Matt reached for some of the red berries and then held them next to his own brown hair. Red berries, red hair, he said, putting his thumb back in his mouth. Do you see? Little one has red hair. The taller Indian stopped laughing as a look of recognition came over his face. He shook his head and said something to his friend. Then they both looked back to Matt, shaking their heads and pointing down the trail. They've seen them, Matt exclaimed, suddenly standing. Will you show me, he asked, pointing to them and then himself. But a worried look came over the Indians' faces, and Matt realized that they too were afraid of the Hessian soldiers. I wish we had something to offer them, Matt sighed. I've got $2, Hooter said, taking the bills out of his pocket. He offered them to the Indians, but they were not impressed. I don't think they're too interested in money, Tony said. Oh, but wait, I do have something they might like. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a pocket video game. It measured just 4 inches long and was made of blue and white plastic. He pressed the on button. Here, you can try it, Tony said, offering the game to the Indians. One of them cautiously opened his hand and accepted the gift. He looked down and was astonished to see a tiny man running back and forth on the small screen. With a frightened yelp, the Indian dropped the game and backed away from it. Tony reached down to the ground and picked it up. With a great deal of coaxing, he placed the game back in the Indian's hand. It's a toy, Tony tried to explain. For fun. Just for fun. He reached over and pushed the tiny button on the bottom panel. As the miniature man jumped up and down, the Indian boy's fingers began to tremble. He was certain that some white man's magic had been used to trap the little man inside the box. He quickly turned the game over in his hand, trying to find a way to free the miniature prisoner. When he opened the door on the back and discovered the batteries, he smiled. The batteries were blue and red and would make good trinkets for trading. He pulled them out and handed them to his friend. No, you've got to leave the batteries in or the game won't work, Tony told him. The Indian turned the game over and looked at the empty screen. Thinking that the tiny man must have fallen out through the door, the Indian boys knelt down on the ground and began to search for him. Tony knelt beside the Indians. You have to put them back in the game, he said, reaching for the batteries. The Indians, however, decided that they liked the magic box and trinkets and didn't want to part with them. They untied pouches that were fastened to their pants, and into these they dropped their newly acquired gifts. Then they tied their pouches tight and resumed their search. Tony finally gave up and sat down on a log to wait, with Matt and Hooter beside him. That video game cost me 10 weeks' allowance, Tony sighed as he watched the Indians continue their hunt. Don't worry about it, Hooter told him. You can always buy another one, once we get home. You mean if we get home, Tony said, kicking a stone. Don't talk like that, Tony, Hooter implored. We're going to get home. We are, aren't we, Matt? Matt looked over at Hooter and tried to smile. Sure, Hooty said. We'll get home. Oh, really? Tony said. And just how do you suppose we're going to do that? Yeah, Matt, Hooter said. How are we going to do that? He looked back over to Matt, who had lowered his eyes to the ground. I don't know just yet, Matt said softly. I don't have all the answers, you know. His voice trailed off into a whisper. Well, you'd better find some answers, Tony suddenly demanded. It was your idea that we start this club, and your idea that we go on the hike. You're the one that always wants to be the leader. You let us into this mess, and so now you'd better figure out how you're going to lead us out of it. Tony's outburst was followed by a long silence. Matt knew Tony was right. He knew that if he hadn't suggested that they go on the hike, none of them would be here now. It was his responsibility to get them home safely. But how? It seemed impossible. Matt suddenly thought of the general and the seemingly impossible situation he had placed his troops in last night. Yet Matt knew that if General Washington had not ordered that dangerous crossing of the Delaware, the entire war may well have been lost. He knew that the taking of Trenton seemed like an impossible task, and yet it was crucial to the rebel cause. The general had everything against him last night, Matt told the others. His army was in rags and half frozen. The river was full of ice. Even the weather was against him. And yet he kept going. He could have stayed home in a warm house in Virginia, but instead he was out here last night, risking his life. Yeah, but his home was in Virginia, miles away. Not light years, Tony added. Tony, what the general went through last night must have seemed just as impossible as our situation seems today, Matt said. I did get you into this, but I really thought every member of this club was ready for adventure and could handle it. You have to admit we've done pretty good so far. He paused, looking from Tony to Hooter. I know it's scary to be here, but when we get home, just think of the memories we'll have, and I'll do everything I can to get us back home. I promise, Matt said with conviction. Tony kicked another stone. I'll believe it when I see it, he said, keeping his eyes to the ground. Well, I believe in you, Chief, Hooter quickly spoke up. I know you can get us home. Matt nodded his thanks to Hooter, but couldn't help frowning. He knew that Tony didn't think he was such a good leader, and he had to admit that he was full of doubts himself. But as he sat on the log, reflecting on all that he'd been through, Matt suddenly realized that he held up pretty well. He hadn't left Israel to die by himself, and he had found the courage to go alone into the woods with Black Jack. I might not have all the answers right now, Matt was thinking, but I have faced danger, and I know that I do have courage. I just hope that I have enough. He sat staring at the ground, lost in thought. When he finally looked up, he saw the Indians standing before them. They had given up their search and were waiting for another offering. One of the Indians looked down at Matt's shoes. He pointed to them and said something that Matt couldn't understand. I think you want your shoes, Chief, Hooter said. Hey, what happened to your sneakers? Tony asked. It's a long story, Matt sighed. I guess I can get along with just socks. If it means they'll help us find Katie and Q, he said, taking off the old shoes. When he handed them over, however, he was surprised to see the Indian pull off the buckles, then throw the shoes on the ground. I don't get it, Hooter mumbled. You'd think that he would want to keep the shoes. It's not like there are shoe stores all over the place. He doesn't need a shoe store, Tony pointed out. Just look at what he's got on his feet. Hooter and Matt looked down at the sturdy, fur-lined moccasin boots that the Indian wore. He probably made them himself. Can you imagine making your own sneakers? I guess we may know a lot about video games, but they sure know more about survival, Matt said, putting his feet back into the old shoes. Just then, the Indians began walking through some bushes off to the right of the trail. They stopped and turned around, waiting for Matt and the boys to follow. Matt stood trying to decide what to do. He hated leaving Blackjack in the security of the trail, but he knew that if there was any chance of finding Katie, this was it. He walked over to Blackjack and patted his head. Thanks for the ride, old boy. I wish I could take you with me, but it looks like we're going off the trail, and you'd get all tangled up in there, Matt whispered, looking into the mule's big dark eyes. Blackjack nodded patiently. Go on now, giddy up, Matt called, giving the mule a slap on the rump. But Blackjack turned his head and looked back, waiting. No, I can't go with you, Matt said, coming up beside him. He nuzzled his face in the mule's soft black coat. I always thought that it would be great to have a horse. Now I know that it would be even better to have a mule. This is goodbye, Blackjack, he whispered. The old mule blinked his eyes and looked as if he were smiling. Go on then, giddy up, Matt called, slapping his rump again. This time Blackjack moved forward and didn't stop. Come on, Matt, they're leaving, Tony called as he and Hooter followed the Indians into the woods. Matt hurried after them, turning around to take one last look. The old black mule seemed dwarfed by the towering evergreens that lined the path. Their silvery branches hung low with the weight of the crystal-like snow. There was a faint tinkling of icicles as the wind gently wove its way through the glittering trees. It was a picture all white and iced with silver, except for the lone traveler, whose soft black fur glistened in the morning light. Matt felt tears coming to his eyes as he stood watching the little mule making his way slowly down the path. So many goodbyes, he thought. First Israel, then Mr. Hornby, now Black Jack. And with each goodbye came the question of who and what would he find next. Would he ever find his way to Katie? Would they ever find their way home? Matt turned and followed the Indians as they moved deeper into the forest. He felt a shiver of excitement run through him as he stepped further into the wild, untamed wood.